We're going to talk about Delilah S. Dawson's book, Bloom, for way too long in far too much detail. This is one of those booktube darlings that has rave reviews from every booktuber I've ever seen reference it. And they are always very careful not to spoil anything or to give too much detail. They'll literally just say that it is cottagecore vibe with a sapphic element that turns horror. Sounds pretty intriguing. If you exclude the sapphic element, it's actually quite similar to one of my favorite reads of last year, You Let Me In by Camilla Bruce, which means I was over the moon when the Weirdo Book Club announced it as the March read. And just like a sidebar here, if you're not part of the Weirdo Book Club and you like these kind of books, you should definitely join up because every single book I've read with the Weirdo Book Club so far has been a banger. And if you like to talk to other people about this kind of stuff, even though it's on Discord and I'm an old person who cannot deal with the Discord, this is as accommodating as possible. If you're looking for a spoiler-free review, I would consider this story more like a character study versus a horror novel. And as a character study, I found it highly engaging. We follow Ro at a low in her life where she's apparently broken up with her cheating boyfriend, moved from New York City back to her southern roots so that she can become an associate professor in a fairly large college town. She's trying to get her groove back, looking for that magic that she sort of lost with her disillusionment of her relationship and her general disillusionment with family ties. And that's when she wanders into this farmer's market stall, finds this girl, Ash, who she is immediately obsessed with. It's the first time she's ever been attracted to a woman, so she has that sort of like self-discovery infatuation element. It's a rebound from this long-term ex-boyfriend she thought she might marry. It's like all these things that wrap together to make her obsessed, and we get to really watch her engage with this early element of the relationship. And as you might expect, an obsessive whirlwind romance easily devolves into horror elements. And that's going to be like my spoiler-free summary. After this point, we're going to talk full spoilers, all the details. So if you haven't read Bloom and you don't want to be spoiled, you should click off the video now. If you're still here with me, let's roll into those general impressions. Dawson has a stunning, unique writing style. I was immediately engrossed by the prose, the descriptions, Ro's feelings, what she wanted, what she was experiencing. I felt like the words themselves kind of put a spell on me, and I was willing to just go with almost anything and everything she said for probably the first 2/3-ish of this book. I love the characters, I love the descriptions, I love this early relationship dynamic. To clarify, I don't think it's a healthy relationship, but it felt like authentic and real to like anyone who'd had that obsession with another person, who really admired them, who had this instant magnetic pull to them. But also Ro has like some stalking issues to go with her obsessive tendencies. She has real problems following boundary directives. Like, Ro is a problematic character, but I could believe who she was, how she was acting as just like an unself-aware, obsessive, like falling into it kind of person. So I'm kind of like floating along on the overall narrative thinking this is going to be an easy 5-star read when we take the turn 2/3 of the way through into the horror element. And I think the way the horror element hit me was actually quite similar to the way I reacted in Tender as the Flesh. I wasn't quite as willing to go with Marcos in Tender as the Flesh, and of course that was always a horror story. It never hid what it was or what it was trying to do. But I was pretty confused about where we could possibly go with Marcos' story, and when we finally got to the place where he gives us the horror part, or where he like tells us where this narrative is going, I immediately was out. Similarly, when we finally get to the horror element of this story, I was almost immediately just out. It was more jarring for me in Bloom than it was in Tender as the Flesh because I was never able to identify with Marcos, figure out what his goal was, figure out if he was the believable narrator or if he was an unreliable one. Like, I was just suspicious of him the whole time, so I was sort of like,
sure, I guess we can go this way, but I hate it.
And with Ro, I really identified with her. I really liked her. I really saw a lot of myself in her. So like the way these things turned felt a little bit like a betrayal of the character exploration we'd set up to this point. Like, I love the fact that Ro is really bookish and that she's out there in the world looking for magic in something she sees as like mundane and boring. I love that she thinks maybe she'll find this magic in her local farmer's market. And like her, I have not not just like a passion for literature, but a deep-seated desire to kind of like share that with other people, to extrapolate, to really dive deep into these narratives, and where like they continually surface and cross-reference in my day-to-day life. And if I was still in my late 20s, like Ro is now, that takes me back to a time where I was also kind of snobbish about my obsession with literature and the way I dissected things. Like, I was less interested in having conversations with people and explaining my point of view and seeing what their point of view was and sort of like educating them on different terminology if they need that education, or possibly learning from them and their take if they have a wider depth of understanding on that specific piece of literature. In my 20s, I kind of felt like people who didn't get it, I didn't want to interact with that much. And I certainly wouldn't want to teach a bunch of required entry-level English classes to college students. Like, none of them want to be there. They all have to be there so they can get on to what really matters. Like, they're looking down on English. They're thinking my degree in English is like a degree in candy bars. You know, all of that grates and wears on you. So I understand where Ro was coming from, why she feels the way she does, especially if like her family hasn't valued her boyfriend obviously didn't value her. Like, she is just in a society where what she loves and is most passionate about is not appreciated. And a great defense mechanism for that, especially in your early 20s, is to decide not to care about those people, that society, or their values in return. And from that perspective, I kind of read Ro's coldness about the girl who'd gone missing as an extension of the disenchantment she had for the world around her. Whether girls go missing either willingly to escape bad situations or for some nefarious reason, it does happen on college campuses more than it should. That's just the disenchanting reality of it. And to a certain degree, I thought Ro had some unexplored resentment about it because people were looking for this missing girl, putting up flyers, asking around, all that kind of stuff. And Ro knows no one would do the same if she went missing, which puts her in like a more vulnerable spot. And even though something awful might have happened to this missing girl, makes it seem like her life beforehand was better than Rose's now. And you know, like Ro, I'm overly curious about people I meet. I'm really intense, like too intense, especially in first meetings. And I have to consistently pull myself back because I do want to ask a million invasive questions. I want to look through all of a person's drawers if they invite me into their house. Like to think that I don't do that anymore, that I have come to recognize it in myself and show restraint and discipline in this area. I understand why Ro feels the way she does. She doesn't even need the justification of I've been cheated on before. Like, the curiosity alone for me is enough. And it helps that when I meet Ash, I also immediately get Ro's Insta obsession. Like, who doesn't love that cottagecore aesthetic, that like walked right out of a fairy tale kind of vibe? The fact that she's making these beautiful cupcakes that she's selling like way too much money, and she does all of these home crafts. Like, I just really admire someone who works on a farm, works with their hands. I admire people who are able to craft, whether that's cooking or soap making or gardening. The fact that she can do all of it is just like wondrous. Like, I am also kind of a little in love with Ash just off her job description. Of course, I personally hope I wouldn't describe someone as a girl with childlike features and then talk about how they were the first woman I'd ever been physically attracted to. That was a little creepy, bro. But even when we get to know Ash, like, the more we get to know her, the more I like her. I love that she's confident and assertive. I love that she's strong and capable and self-assured. And I think all of those qualities are a great balance for our like slightly obsessive, caught in her head, over anxious Ro. There's a lot Ro can learn from Ash when it comes to that general relationship dynamic. And as someone who's a little bit overly nervous and a little bit too people-pleasing, it is always really refreshing to run into someone who will just say what they want or refuse me if they don't want to do something. Because it means I can say,
Oh, I want to go eat over here.
and if they don't want to do that, they're just gonna tell me that. It makes me feel more free to like express what I want to do or why I want to do it, and then know that if they come with me, it's either because they truly want to support me in that thing and they're not upset about going and doing something they're less than thrilled about, or they also really want to do that thing. And both of those to me in like a relationship, whether it's a friendship, romantic, is kind of like a win. We find out Ash is like self-sufficient on the farm, and I love that for her. It would be a dream of mine to be more self-sufficient than I am now. I also love that she hates the internet and social media. Obviously, I'm online, I'm here on YouTube, so I'm not completely off grid, but I don't interact in any other social media. And if we're gonna be real, as I was writing this script, I realized that my significant other is not on any social media at all. Like, you would not find him if you looked him up. So obviously, I don't think that's like weird. And I love them sitting out in the porch swing and just watching watching the environment pass them by, all of that works for me, is not a stumbling block in the slightest. Their actual relationship, almost from its inception, is pretty unhealthy on both sides. Ro is not over her ex, is 100% a rebound in the very purest sense, and a little bit it comes off like, I don't know, a bisexual tourist, because this is her first attraction to a woman. She's like experimenting or exploring. There's a delicate balance there between like honesty and actual feeling or truth and like a fetishization. I think Dawson does a good job keeping it on the line of like true exploration, learning, trying to sort of like piece this new part of herself together, but I could see why other people might feel it tips the balance the other way. And because everything else in Ro's life sucks at this point in time, she grabs onto Ash like she is a drowning person, and just like that drowning person grabs onto someone else trying to save them and takes them down with them, that's kind of how Ro like sabotages this relationship. Obviously at the end we get a horror twist element and we see that like there probably was no salvaging their relationship from the very start, but if Ash and Ro had just been normal girls doing normal girl things, Ro is the saboteur who ruins everything. And I think part of what I really liked about the story is I knew it was a sapphic romance that was turning into horror, and I wasn't exactly sure what the horror was. The more obvious choice is for Ash to be some kind of murderous something or other, right? Because she lives by herself in this farm in a remote location and she's self-sufficient and kind of quiet and off the grid. But Ro does all of this very disturbing, annoying, scary behavior that makes it seem like she has the potential to be the horrific person that she might end up kidnapping Ash and like holding her hostage or something if Ash decides to try to leave her. So for the longest, there's this very exciting element in the story for someone who knows it's a sapphic horror, trying to figure out who is the horror. And eventually it does turn out that Ash is a serial killer, which is the obvious pick, and she's doing all of the very obvious over the top things. So personally, I found that really disappointing. And I just wanted to pay a little homage to Ro as a potential serial killer. For starters, she's dealing with plenty of her own trauma, starting with like a childhood where it seems like her mother was resentful to having her and put early expectations on her that she would have to marry someone wealthy so that her mother could live off her wealthy husband's income. And to a certain degree, it seems like for the longest, Ro was trying to actually achieve this for her mother while also trying to find her own happiness, because she does pursue a literature degree, get her doctorate, and become an associate professor, which is not making a lot of money and doesn't leave a lot of time for her to be shopping for husbands. But she also was together with this man who was pretty well off and whom they were talking about engagement until she discovered he'd been cheating on her for a long time. Her mother opposes the breakup specifically because that was her like meal ticket or whatever, and it spurs Ro into a low contact relationship with her mother where she's like dealing with all of this resentment that she has for like the position her mom put her in. Maybe she even blames her mother for her choosing to overlook some of the red flags because this was a good win-win for both her and her mom if this relationship worked out. And then she has the trauma of being cheated on all by itself, where her fiance more or less says like Ro wasn't available enough to him, she wasn't pretty enough for him, she wasn't graceful or elegant or all of the things, and it makes Ro feel small and sort of ugly and less than. It throws her back into like her awkward academia sort of persona. And being in her late 20s, she's having that crisis where she thinks she's missed the boat on the long-term partner marriage thing. So when Ro enters this relationship with Ash, she is possessive and jealous and smothering. She's so suspicious that there's someone else in Ash's life and has literally no reason to feel that way. There's things that she is saying are like warning bells or red flags or whatever are nothing burgers. And on top of that, the fact that she can't see anything about Ash on social media or watch any interactions and stuff is her like thinking that Ash is hiding things and like keeping some kind of secret life separate from hers, which, you know, spoiler, she is, but it's that she's a serial killer, not that she is a cheater. And I think in some ways this highlights the fact that I think social media is bad for you, that it enables behavior that is unhealthy in human beings and sets expectations of transparency and like revelations between people approval that is just unearned and really no one's business. Like where I go, what I do, my interactions with other people, those are mine to reveal or not to reveal to who I choose. I do not want to publicly post about it. And the fact that lots of people do publicly post about it, and it is normal to sort of like online stalk people with their updates and stuff and like give them likes and views based off of this, all just really kind of freaks me out. The fixation that Ro has on Ash having touched the food she's eating, and therefore her like ingesting some of the molecules and those molecules becoming part of her forever and having like Ash with her forever, borders onto super creepy. Like when she takes that snake plant home and she's like breathing on the snake plant and thinking about how Ash breathed on the snake plant, and now she's getting some of the breath that Ash had into her own system via the snake plant. That's like a lot. There's a poetry in it that makes it pretty in the moment, but that kind of mentality consistently coming up over and over again is definitely concerning. It does suggest that she is driven like to possess and maintain some kind of relationship with Ash, and that in of itself might drive like some kind of kidnapping, hostage kind of situation. And I'm on like Team Ash's side for most of this story, because Ro going over her house the next day, specifically after Ash told her not to come to her house for the next 3 days and they set up a time they would next meet, was bonkers to me. It was so invasive. Especially because she knows that Ash is working. The fact that she went to a play and stalked a student who happened to like one of Ash's cupcakes but otherwise had no relation to her, also just insano style. The fact that after she had a fight with Ash about going to her house when Ash specifically asked her not to visit, and then they came up with a compromise which would be her writing and sending letters, she decided to bring the letter to the mailbox instead of sending it via the post office. Like, girl, you just got in serious trouble for showing up unannounced at her house, and the next day you do it again. Crazy to me. Just incredibly wild, unacceptable behavior. Definitely stalking, boundary crossing, dangerous to me. Like, I found so much of that aspect of Ro's personality really threatening. And the way she could like talk herself into overcoming Ash's boundaries. Like they have a falling out and then they make up. That night the power goes out. Instead of waking Ash up and insisting that Ash switch the fuse box, she goes looking around the floor of the house trying to find it, learns that the fuse box is in the one place Ash has specifically asked her not to go, and justifies that she should go in there anyways because Ash has to learn to let her in or whatever for the relationship to work. Like, no girl, you guys have not readdressed where the boundaries are. You have not progressed in a relationship where you have free access to this woman's house. This is not okay. And of course, going down into the breaker box, flipping the breaker, leads her to learning that Ash is a serial killer. And for me, the way we were driving this obsession, this like fixation on Ash, where I legitimately thought this girl might kidnap Ash or might harm her to keep like physical mementos, like a little note of Ash's hair or some of her blood or like her fingernails or something. All of that like was building and building. We find out Ash is the serial killer and Ro immediately flips it. It all ends up feeling a little bit fickle to me. And I know that sounds crazy because like obviously you find out someone you love is a serial killer and you realize that they're a monster and you're in danger. But I don't think you have like a full force obsession, interest, love for someone and you can just turn that off. You can be horrified by what you're seeing. You can know that this is over and you need police and safety and all kinds of stuff like that. But I just don't believe in the stop and go of emotions like that. And in that regard, I feel like Ro should have been fighting herself a little bit more to like stay firm against Ash, especially when Ash is like presenting a more loving, interested side to her. Minimally, even if Ro does eventually decide she's anti-serial killer Ash and doesn't want to play assistant to the cannibal, I needed it to be less of a tether snap and an instant change, and for it to be more conflicted and more waffling back and forth, to be more true to Ro's actual character. Because Ro doesn't have these like turn on a dime kind of emotional strengths, which I think is part of what I really hated about this twist ending. Is Ro is just out immediately, like whatever obsession spell first time involved involved with ladies, like what's going on with her, she immediately snaps out of it, does a 180 to reverse course and get the hell out. And in fact, we get like a lot of internal monologue rapid firing where Ro is re-examining every interaction she's ever had with Ash and like rewriting it in her brain to be nefarious, evil, and bad. Which, even as Ash being a serial killer, a lot of how Ash approached the relationship I felt like was normal, healthy, and fine. And I did not appreciate Ash having all these red flags suddenly. Which rolls me into what Ro considers red flags in a relationship. Something that would have turned her off in a man, but Ash's womanliness like disarmed her into rolling along, which we'll talk about that part too in a minute. For starters, from the beginning, Ash is always challenging her to try new things. At one point in time, Ro lets Ash pick out the cupcake flavors. Ro protests like the fruit flavors because she doesn't like artificial fruit. Ash pauses, thinks about it, and says like, "You'll like it when I do it. It's not artificial taste." And surprise of all surprises, Ro does like the strawberry fruit flavored cupcakes, so Ash is right. This is a situation where a new person in your life, whether they're a friend or a significant other, is supposed to challenge you and introduce you to new things. And that's how a friendship or a relationship can actually reframe something that you still don't really like, because you like hanging out with other people who are happy, you like seeing what gives them joy, them being with you makes it fun. And like, this is much easier to do when it comes to food. You know, people tell me all the time, I don't like thing X or I don't like thing Y. And as someone who really likes to cook and makes a lot of things, I often ask like, oh, how have you had that before? What didn't you like about it? And then from that, I can suggest different ways to prepare it, or I can make it for them in a different way. My friends and family are nice to me. They try things that I offer them. And of course, they can be honest. They can tell me they don't like it, and then I drop it. I don't insist they eat it or like keep trying to make the thing work. A good friend, a good family member, a good relationship, they're continually trying to show you new things. And part of that is like challenging you to try things you don't like again. The issue here is this could have been a toxic trait of Ash's if Ro had said, no, I don't like that. Ash had said, but try it for me. And Ro had said, no, I really hate this. Or Ro had tried it and then said, no, I don't like this. And Ash was like, we'll finish it anyways because it's mine. The closest we see to that is when Ash pushes like some olive mixture onto Ro and Ro's like, oh, I hate this. And Ash makes a sour face. But to be honest, Ro was so incredibly rude about how she rejected the olive thing that Ash had made by hand. And the same way Ash was taking so much pride in making these things that Ro likes, of course she's gonna take it personally if you're like, this is the most disgusting thing I've ever ate. And even then, like, Ash was hurt. She was showing that what had happened had hurt her, but she did not insist that Ro keep eating the olives. So to me, like, Ro was actually the one who comes out worse for wear on the like pushing my boundaries, forcing me to eat things conversation, because she never establishes a solid boundary that gets transgressed. She always acquiesces to please Ro. She's always afraid of what Ash will do. She doesn't want to like make her angry or like give her reasons to reject her or whatever, instead of wanting to see if the two of them are compatible in a relationship where they're both honest and authentic. Ro talks about how Ash keeps insisting on using Ro's full name, which is Rosemary, when Ro said she doesn't like it. But again, this is a situation where partners take pet names you don't like and transform them into a positive experience or like a personal inside joke between the two of you, or like something special. And from Ash's perspective, where she is Ash and Ro is Rosemary, like Rosemary and Ash, or like Rosemary's Ash, like these are all kind of fun like couple names, nicknames, the way the two of them sort of like line up even when it comes to their names. Not to mention that Ash loves plants and growing things and all of that kind of thing. So it makes sense for her to love Rosemary, whose name is a plant, and to love using that name and like sort of as an endearment, the same way she like takes care of and finds plants endearing. There is definitely a potential for using her full name to be a special connection between the two of them that is different than when other people use Rosemary's full name. And since Ro does not push back when Ashley starts slipping Rosemary into their conversations, it does feel like she's accepting this is a special relationship, a special connection, a special secret meaning between the two of them, where she should have said like, hey, I really don't like that name, don't call me that. I already told you I don't like it, I meant it. For me, the issue is on Ro not addressing her discomfort, possibly not even having any discomfort until this moment where she's like backwards justifying Ash's serial killerness. And two, I think Ash has a right to defend her privacy. I know she was defending it because she's a serial killer and she's using the people and all of her like crafting stuff. But you know, I work from home and I hate when people stop by the house unannounced. Both my husband and I sometimes work from home, and I know sometimes I go up there to talk to him about things and he's slightly annoyed at me because he's working. And the same thing happens in reverse. Sometimes he comes to talk to me or to bother me and I'm annoyed because I'm working. Setting like good boundaries when you are working from home is really hard. And the fact that Ash knows what she has to do to set those boundaries, that she is going to be 100% engrossed in these activities, it's going to take her this amount of time, that's admirable and you should respect that. You know, even when I was working in retail and the public could come in and say hello, I didn't like when people intentionally came to visit. Like, it was one thing if they needed to shop and I was working and we happened to bump into each other, but it was another thing if they came just to say like hello to me. I did not like that. You know, I was in the middle of something, it put me in an awkward situation. Like, am I nice and acquiescing to them? Do I continue to do my job? How does all my coworkers feel about this situation? I just really think you should leave people alone at work, and especially if someone tells you not to go to their work, not to drop stuff off at their work, you should just respect that. Like, Ro claims her curiosity is normal and that couples do things like this, but in my experience, no they don't. And when they try to, I have broken up with people over this. Again, this is a case where I don't think Ash set unhealthy boundaries. She was very clear. I thought, given where they were in the relationship, where they were only like known each other for a few weeks and had only been dating for maybe like half of that time, this seemed like pretty normal. Ro is right. Eventually Ash needs to be a little bit more open with her, needs to let her in more, but they need to have a discussion about the pacing and timing of that, because Ro's boundaries not only were very clear but felt very reasonable to me for how early they were in that relationship. To that end, it's not Ash setting up a ridiculous, unreasonable boundary or some kind of like invisible barrier. It's Ro repeatedly crossing that boundary and pushing and instigating and arguing and insisting that she is right and Ash is weird that's the problem. One thing that is a little bit of a red flag is how Ash handles confrontation and generally does violence even in front of Rosemary. So at one point in time they're both sitting out in the swing and like a raccoon comes up and Ash expresses hatred for them, which makes total sense. Raccoons are very dangerous around a regular house, let alone around a farm. And you do need to find a way to either deter them or to get rid of them. And for a farm where there's like chickens and crops and stuff like that in the line, because raccoons have opposable thumbs and are so able to get into pretty much anything given enough time, usually you do have to kill them to eliminate that threat. However, beating a raccoon to death, hitting it multiple times with a shovel while someone else is feet away from you is pretty intense. Even if Ash doesn't have a gun and needs to use the shovel, I feel like one hit would do it. Same way you'd like take a snake's head off, you could do that with a raccoon and a sharp enough shovel. So I don't think killing the raccoon is the problem, but I do have some concerns about the level of brutality Ash showed while doing it. Also, for Ro to be in that much shock and to be that upset about it and to stay on the swing set and have another drink, that felt like not great. Like, Ro really should have left. But again, that's not Ash's fault that Ro didn't leave. That's Ro crossing her own comfort level, pushing herself beyond what she normally would. Ash did nothing to instigate that. Then there's the violence that Ash does when they catch a man recording their kiss. And I don't think it was wrong for her to take the phone, to delete it. I don't even necessarily have an issue with her throwing the phone in the river. I think the keys might have been a bridge too far because it's so hard to find car keys in a river. But even then, I can't be like too mad at it. To a certain degree, I sort of like it. It wasn't super violent. Like, she didn't end up maiming or harming this man beyond anything he could easily recover from. She just cost him like some monetary whatever and some time, because now he has to get someone else to bring keys if he can't find his keys in the river. Of course, we come to find out that Ash went back for this man, abducted him, and like like slowly cannibalized him, so that was less okay. But at this juncture, like Ro finds this incredibly jarring and like flips out and kind of goes into like this state of shock that Ash has to kind of talk her through, which indicates to me this was way too much for Ash and that this relationship is not going to work as it stands. But I don't necessarily think that Ash is the one that has to do any fixing. I think it's Ro's obligation to back off. Though being overly brutal with the raccoon is a red flag, and it's a red flag whether a man or a woman does it, because taking a long time to kill an animal when you could do it quickly is a red flag, period, across all genders. I am less inclined to find her treatment of this man a red flag, and I don't think if a man did this instead of a woman I'd find it a red flag necessarily. I do think like if a man had confronted another man like this, it might have escalated into a physical altercation, and I don't like physical altercations, so I might find that aspect brings it over the top for me. But just like what actually went on in these scenes, not looking at the fact that Ash like went back for him and murdered him, this is a Ro problem to me, not necessarily an Ash problem. And I guess that rolls me into the breakup scene where Ro goes to see Ash at the farmer's market as expected. Ash is in the middle of an important conversation with this guy who we later find out like owns a hotel and was looking to get like some local soaps from Ash to fill all of his rooms. And Ro goes in, sees the two of them talking, sees this guy's a good looking guy and that Ash is excited, and is immediately on the defensive jealous mode. She's no reason to feel this way really. Like it's all in her head, it's completely made up, and yet she's like here embarrassing herself, overly bright, trying to like insert herself in a conversation that's between these two people, trying to get Ash to like curtail this and hang out with her. And it's like Ro does not understand why Ash goes to farmers markets and Ash's need to like maintain a livelihood and therefore interact with customers and not immediately blow them off when her girlfriend enters the shop. Now there are hints in the story that it's more to it than that, that perhaps Ash is like embarrassed by the fact that she is attracted to women, perhaps like her grandmother has ingrained some sort of conservative narrative in her because she is very sensitive about public displays of affection, which arguably now that we know she's a serial killer, it could have more to do with the fact that she thinks she's eventually going to kill Ro and doesn't want to be associated with Ro when she goes missing. But on its face, before we find out Ash is the serial killer, it also could be part of her traumatic childhood and upbringing and like some internalized homophobia that she needs to examine, because some of Ash's response to Ro feels a little unfair, where she doesn't like acknowledge that she knows Ro and that she's going to be with her in a minute. She's in the middle of a conversation with this man, like pretending she doesn't know Ro is a lot, but also dropping everything to go see Ro would have not been a fair response either. There was like a middle ground that should have been reached between the two of them. So depending on how sensitive you are about someone being out in public with you, there is some red flagging behavior there, but that's what should have been discussed, not whether or not Ash was cheating on her. Despite my gripes with Ro and my defense of Ash, I don't think the outcome for Ro was deserved. I didn't find it cathartic or exciting that she got killed off. It does seem like there's this through line in the narrative asking the reader to figure out who is worst or who is the real horror, all of which kind of flies out the window when Dawson gives us the serial killer reveal in the back, because indisputably the serial killer is the worst person. And while I don't agree with Ro's assessment of red flags or like cruel, mean behavior from Ash, I do recognize that these were ways Ash was kind of trying to groom her to make her the next victim. So I think making a character who is as flawed as Ro and who so many people dislike, even though I'm a big Ro fan, like huge Ro apologist over here, I think it is trying to sort of ask the question of whether or not we feel bad for Ro or what we do when we have a no perfect victim sort of situation. But like to me, I think probably accidentally Dawson has a more interesting narrative about people in power or the majority transgressing on people without power or people in the minority, and then that majority person being killed for their transgression. Just to be clear, I'm not talking about transgressive literature. I'm talking about one character from one group transgressing over the boundary into someone else's space without permission or thought, and then getting killed as a result. So like an example of this in fairy tales might be in Beauty and the Beast. Belle's father takes shelter in the prince's castle, and Belle's dad knows he's not really supposed to be there. Circumstances circumstances have kind of forced him into it, but when he transgresses for real is when he walks through the garden and clips the roses. This is a bridge too far, and the beast comes out and intends to punish him with torment and life imprisonment. Of course, we know in this story Belle takes his place and it becomes like a romantic fairy tale savior kind of story from there. But this is a horror novel, so obviously Ro transgresses and is punished. She's a woman stuck in the mundane world who crosses over into what she considers magic. She's a girl raised with a duty to her family who, as a young woman, abandons that duty and seeks her own passions and life separate. She's a heterosexual woman who finds that she actually can be attracted to women. After instigating a relationship with Ash, she pries into her life, pushing to see her more, pushing to have more influence, pushing to have more ways to contact her, trying to pry into all of her secrets and all of her off-limits space. By the time Ro meets her end, she has crossed so many boundaries. And when it comes to transgression and crossing boundaries, I see a lot of similarity between Bloom and the 1992 movie Candyman. Obviously, these two are different in a lot of ways, but I think comparing these two still has merit, so indulge me for a moment. In Candyman, graduate student Helen Lyle transgresses on socioeconomic lines to investigate an urban legend of the Candyman. Like Ro, she believes that she knows better than the locals around her. She's curious about their past and perhaps not curious or wary enough about their present living conditions. Though presumably she assumes investigating this urban legend and disproving it will have positive net benefit for them, which Helen does conclude the Candyman isn't real, and she puts a close to the myth. Little does she know that by discrediting the Candyman, she started a new supernatural cycle of terror with her at the center, all with the larger goal of reinforcing his story. Like Ro, Helen has done nothing wrong. One might say she was thoughtless or unintentionally offensive to people, but she wasn't out to harm anyone. Helen and Ro both struggle to interact with the norms, partially because of their elevated class and educational status, partly because they are women looking to thrive in a male-dominated field, and also partially because they're women and have an additional associated vulnerability with them that we don't generally attribute to men. They position themselves in some way as saviors to these folks, and they attempt to use part of their backgrounds to show that they can relate to them. In Ro's case, she is going easy on Ash and trying to lead her out of her traumatized childhood and help her work through that, and I don't know, whatever way she thinks she's doing that. Ro also thinks that she can relate to Ash because she grew up in the South and was around farmers and hunters, so she knows the lifestyle and knows the traditional food and all that kind of stuff, even though she's also idealizing this farm life, idealizing cooking, maintaining this kind of very characterized home. Also, both Helen and Ro have a level of romantic entanglement with their monsters. They seem captivated and hypnotized by them, which in and of itself is kind of another transgression. Obviously, with Helen and Candyman, there's human and supernatural, and there's white woman with black man as a biracial couple that is transgressive in its own way, particularly in the early 90s. Here, Ro is a heterosexual woman interested in another woman, which makes her bi or pan, potentially. Or maybe it just makes her gay for Ash, which is problematic in its own way, but a vehicle we could interpret this romantic relationship and would face its own challenges and prejudices in conventional society. And that brings us over in comparing Ash and the Candyman, who are both portrayed as unstoppable forces, and there's a complicated understanding of what they bring to their local community. Ash is a local business owner who brings products and services to the local businesses around her and who hypothetically is working in an environmentally friendly kind of way. In her serial killer guise, Ash picks off bad people as well as rando innocent folks. While she is contributing to the crime statistics, she's also sort of reducing the amount of overall criminals. Instead of having to watch out for a bunch of bad people, you just have to watch out for Ash. And Candyman sort of has a similar deal with who he does and doesn't kill in Caprini Green. Some of them are innocent people, but some of them are also bad. The fact that there is this supernatural force that could come and get you does keep some people in check, even as it terrorizes the society as a whole. And I'd say that both Candyman and Ash sort of embody their stereotypically feared elements. Candyman's origin story was originally as a human who had a relationship with a white woman and then was brutalized and murdered for it. As a spirit, he embodies the huge, angry, unstoppable. Like, his murderers literally made him the racist stereotype that white people fear. And Ash is that lesbian menace. She lures straight women to their demise, and Siren calls men's to their death as well. By the end of Candyman, Helen's downfall is inevitable, and it's a release of sorts for the audience. Candyman has been wronged enough and built up enough of a presence that the audience could find catharsis and symmetry in Helen's demise. And in a similar way in Bloom, it feels like Rose's fate is also inevitable, and her death would be a kind of release. However, through all of this obsession and need that she's built up, we're almost rooting for her to become assistant to the cannibal, not the final last girl and not a victim, which is kind of where these two narratives completely diverge, because Helen struggles against the Candyman until the end. And though she doesn't save herself, perhaps she never could, she does save the innocent baby. And in becoming the Candyman's victim, she does gain a measure of supernatural power, appearing to her ex-lover in the mirror when he repeats her name 3 times and murdering him. She loses her own autonomy, but gains a measure of Candyman's power in his shadow. Her defiance could never have won her freedom, but it does grant her some concessions. Meanwhile, Ro rejects Ash entirely, and where she kind of denies Ash her own identity by magnifying all of Ash's mannish traits. She talks about all the things that she previously admired in Ash and turns them into warning signals, red flags, and other negative things. She does not wish to understand or empathize with a monster, so she rejects all of the work she was doing to sort of get to know Ash, learn more about her past, perhaps help her heal. She doesn't even want to give Ash the benefit of like the traumatized label anymore because nothing justifies what she's doing, which like you cannot be justified in doing something but also acknowledge that there are a lot of complicated driving factors that might have created someone who would be horrible. Ro never acknowledges it's too late for her own escape. She continually thinks she can outsmart, overpower, or somehow get one over on Ash. Rather than prioritizing someone else's survival over her own as Helen does the baby, Ro embraces killing the man in the basement because it might later give her a chance to escape Ash. All of which leaves Ro living a half-life trapped at Ash's farm. She struggles to escape until the end of the book, continuing to fail at fully recognizing Ash's capabilities and scope. And unlike Helen, who can't transform into the oppressed minority, Ro has the capability to code switch from heterosexual presenting to queer presenting. Could have allowed her the ability to take on the same guise as Ash and perhaps become part of that group. And I think her ability to code switch, or maybe even the perception that she went from being heterosexual into bisexual or pansexual, which is part of the LGBTQA+ group, made people think that she was on a more even playing field or perceived herself more as an equal or perhaps like an inclusion into that group instead of a transgression over a line. But Ro doesn't ever really do the work to fully evaluate her place in this space, how she had joined this group, what that means in a larger endeavor. And because she maintains that level of ignorance, she's never able to fully integrate into the society and ends up punished for this transgression. Now, while this is sort of like how I view the narrative, it's still kind of hard for me to engage with it. Candyman is a supernatural story, and therefore it's kind of speculative in nature. We can accept there's like unstoppable, hungry, demanding forces in a supernatural tale. The only way to set things right really might be with a character's death. It's not a story about earning or fairness. It's a story about Helen transgressing and interacting with forces larger than herself that she doesn't understand in a careless way, and her being required to make an ultimate sacrifice to set things right. There is like a larger horror convention we could talk about where women sacrifice themselves for the greater good of society, but I don't think most people look at this story and believe that Helen earned her death. I think they look at this story as like a necessary result of her carelessness because of the supernatural element. If you had put it in a more mundane perspective, I think you would find that people would look at it more critically, which unfortunately rolls us right into Bloom, that's in a mundane real world sort of scenario, except with serial killers, which is always a little over the top, larger than life, which means Ro has 3 potential options once we go into the serial killer narrative. She can survive as a final last girl. She can accept Ash and become assistant to the cannibal. She can become a victim of Ash's. And there's really a huge disconnect in this narrative between like the eat, pray, love, but sort of creepy and obsessive path that Ro was walking on, where she's sort of finding herself, getting her groove back, starting a new relationship, and these three options for her ending. Especially because as someone who reads a lot of serial killer fiction, I have seen all three of these endings executed well, or at least adequately before. And what we get on the serial killer reveal and afterwards feels very eye-rolling to me. And to be fair, pitching me almost any of these three endings feels kind of cheesy, over the top, and a little bit like we've jumped the shark. But as long as we're jumping the shark, let's do the best of these three endings. I'm most interested in seeing Ro roll right into full obsession, takeover, identity subsumed, becoming the assistant to the cannibal. We've been letting this obsession, new relationship, discovery of our bisexuality lead us in a dangerous forward way henceforth. Let's just go ahead and lean into that for this ending. She can surrender the few markers she has of personality that still remain, like her intensely academic nature, her desire to thrive as a professor someday. She can keep her writing, but she can swap to only poetry, even though that's not something she wrote before she met Ash. And that can be like another way that she sort of like conformed to Ash's idea of what's best for her and her obsession with Ash. And I think through this kind of obsession where she like joins with Ash and agrees with her and like surrenders herself entirely, that would have been significantly more cathartic and would have been a better close to the loop that we'd established in the first 2/3 of the story. But that's not what we do. Ro decides she's going to try to survive by playing to her own skill set, but Ro does not have a skill set to overcome Ash physically or mentally. It's always a doomed decision that's going to reduce her to more meat for the grinder, and it's an ending that makes all the beautiful and entrancing writing that came before it feel a little bit like a waste of time, because Ro doesn't come out of this transformed and full of that obsession. She doesn't come out of this knowing herself better or being more self-aware. Like if she had surrendered, been killed in that instant because she knew herself to be incapable of fighting, in a lot of ways that would have been preferable to the ending we saw too, because it would have at least arced her character study into being self-aware and realizing her own flaws, perhaps even realizing her culpability. Also, I feel a little bit conflicted about the ending of Bloom. Ro is discovering a new element of her sexuality, but because she's initiating a lesbian romance for the first time, it's sort of like reinforcing that stereotype that lesbians, like, I don't know, trick straight women into relationships and sort of steal them away and ruin them. You know, like on one side, I'm here to support women's rights as well as women's wrongs, so I love the idea of a female serial killer and I love that it's sapphic. But on the other side, I do see how you could read things into this that are very stereotypical and not necessarily flattering or great messaging. And I do think overall, just based off of the narrative this story takes and the gendering of Ash and what's red flags for men versus red flags for women, like not just red flags in general, it felt like overall a very conservative tone that was a little bit off-putting to me personally. And that kind of rolls me into discussing the gendered interpretation of how Ash is a unique threat, because Ro seems to believe that she was treating Ash different because she was a woman than she would have been treating a man, and that Ash displayed character traits that in a man would have been red flags and would have sent her away long before she got to this point. And I just want to be like, girl, what? Like, I suppose I would have been more wary about going to a man's home alone, especially if he lived out like isolated on a farm, than I would be going to a woman who is isolated in a farm home. But otherwise, I really don't have an issue with how Ash acted regardless of the gender. And I don't like how Ro plays oblivious in this moment either, because she isn't stupid. She has to recognize that Ash is stronger than her, and that Ash is faster than her, and that Ash is more physically capable than her in a whole host of ways. And like, whether that is something you see in a man or a woman, it's something for you to make note of and do with what you will. Like, someone physically stronger than you have to make decisions about whether or not you trust them to treat their extra strength and power responsibly. And two, the relationship between Ro and Ash is not good, but Ro seems to be the one very sensitive to Ash's emotion. She's always like walking on eggshells, perceiving all their conversations and interactions as tests that Ash might dismiss her if she hits wrong. So instead of like having an organic and authentic relationship, Ash, Ro is always trying to feed her the information or the takes that Ash wants to hear. That's not Ash's fault, and that's bad to do whether you do it with a woman or a man. All that said, a broken clock is right twice a day, and Dawson speaking through Ro in this monologue is kind of correct in that the most interesting thing about this book is the sapphic relationship and the female serial killer versus a traditionally male serial killer. Like, if you pitch this story to me exactly as it is but make Ash a man, I probably don't read it. I've kind of seen the trad man farmer doing male crafty things. I sort of like have seen him be self-assured and capable and deal with a mousy woman coming out of a bad relationship. I've certainly seen more than my fair share of male serial killers. There's nothing like unique or engaging about that. And because there's nothing unique in Ash's character if Ash is a man, it becomes hard to support the instant obsession and enthrallment that Ro has that sort of like kicks this whole thing off. Like, part of it is that Ash has all these qualities that are kind of unique in women or that stand out a little bit more in women than men. And part of it is that Ro is experiencing her first like same-sex attraction moment, and there's like an obsession and a curiosity with that too. And if you take all of those elements away, then I don't know what the spark is here. At least I don't know what the immediacy of the spark is. Like, you can pitch me a love story that's heteronormative here, but it's going to take a lot more time and space to develop. I just think this book needed more time to cook because Dawson's right, the female serial killer and the sapphic element is what's engaging in the story, but her like sort of monologuing through Ro at the end about how that's engaging or what that means is just dead wrong and actually kind of offensive. And even with like my own examination of it here, I have also only scratched the surface of why a heteronormative relationship wouldn't have been interesting to but a sapphic one was. Needed more developmental edit, period. Which rolls me into going easy on Ash because she has unresolved childhood trauma. When Ro realizes that Ash is a serial killer, she is like outraged because she's been going easy on Ash because she has childhood trauma that's unresolved and untouched. And it's like she's denying Ash's trauma or that things that Ash is doing are a result of trauma, when I would argue that even this serial killer element is an like outwelling of her childhood trauma, and that denying the horrible things that happened with her grandmother, the issues she probably has with attachment for being like abandoned by her mom and not really being sure she was gonna live with grandma or mom for a while, like all that stuff is sort of very foundational to Ash. And really the issue is that Ash has way more trauma and has gone a way darker path than Ro is ready to handle. I'm not saying that childhood trauma forgives what Ash has done, like becoming a serial killer is obviously not the solution here, but I am saying the way that Ro interpreted this and like recontextualized how she was acting, how this like enabled Ash to slide closer to her, and like, I don't know, supposed that Ash actually wasn't suffering from trauma, all of that is really wrong and kind of dismissive, especially because of the details we had before and then a couple extra gory details we get after this reveal. All are like very heavily indicating like pretty deep mental illness that was created through significant childhood abuse. Again, not forgiving behaviors, but more like a deeper understanding and empathy here was definitely needed, especially if Ro was going to use her words to survive and escape Ash. And that rolls me into like the cannibal serial killing element where all the food is people. I don't know, I feel like this was a cheap, gross ick factor. I was fine with the lard in the cupcakes being people fat, and the soap being made out of people, and the pottery having people ashes in it, and even the plants using like people fertilizer. But the fact that Ro visually saw the cuts of meat and like described them as beef or pork when they were actually people is weird to me. Granted, I haven't ever seen a person butchered up. Maybe it's a lot closer than I think, but I do think people parts, even cut up and processed, would not look the same as animal parts. The shapes would be wrong, the sizing would be wrong. I don't think you'd be able to get the right kind of flavors or textures. Like, she talks about how she had ate the sausages and the prosciutto and all of that is secretly people, and I just don't think that you could get a believable prosciutto with people meat. Sausage I might be willing to give you because ground up meat with the right seasoning can usually do that. And in fact, I even think plant-based sausage is pretty similar with a significantly better textural component than actual meat sausage crumbles, but flavor-wise, pretty much the same. I don't know, overall I felt like we just were going for that extra goofy over the top factor without really considering all the things that Ro saw and tasted and experienced that I just don't think would have worked that way. Which leads me to the ending. There is this reveal that Ash is the killer. Ro kills the man to try and like win Ash's favor. We fade to black and jump sometime in the future. And I think the fading to black is a huge disservice here that Dawson did specifically so she could jump scare us with Ro with no legs in a wheelchair. It definitely breaks the character study element because her resolving to escape Ash at all costs, including murdering a man to try and like win Ash to her side so she has a chance to escape later, only works if we can see her resolve be put through the fire. So like seeing the moment where Ro wakes up strapped to that same table and realizes that Ash is gonna remove her legs so that she cannot run from her would have been a really good moment to see. Like I can imagine it in my head. Ash lets her go to the bathroom after murdering that dude. Ash has her clean up the mess she made down. Ash like somehow drugs her and then Ro wakes up on the table and realizes that she didn't get away as cleanly as she thought. That's like one moment where she again tests her resolve to like reject or accept Ash. Whether this like solidifies her resolve or breaks it is an important clarifying moment for her character. And then the next moment that would have been really great to see is when Ash first tries to feed her legs back to her. That again is another like key breaking decision making point. And we just skip that to jump in the future to see Rose continuing to resist after this. And I just don't think that Ro has reserve for this. And because we didn't get to experience those scenes, which would have been intense and horrific and gruesome and really bolstered the horror element as well as the character study, I think like this jump to the future just kind of fails on those fronts. This has been my entirely too close of an examination of a book that shouldn't have been that deep, Bloom by Delilah S. Dawson. I really did have a great time with the first 2/3 of this novel, and the fact that I enjoyed that so much is probably part of why I am obsessed with the back third and all of its critical failures. I'm interested in reading more from Dawson in the future. I hope that she improves her twists and her ability to write horror scenes if she intends to stick with that genre. But talk to me. Have you read Bloom? Were you surprised by it? Give me all those micro reviews in those comments down below. And if you got this far with nothing else to share, leave me a flower emoji in those comments down below. And as always, keep reading.